The chestnut mare stood like a sentinel against God's wrath, her hooves planted on rotting floorboards while the mountain bled mud and stone around her. Angela Bloom had seen horses panic, had watched them flee from fire and flood, but Echo refused to move from the collapsing cabin, even as timber groaned like dying men. Something sacred burned in the mare's eyes, a knowledge that transcended human understanding, a covenant written in blood and breath that would not be broken. Subscribe now, because some bonds run deeper than survival itself. The radio crackled with static and desperation as Angela Bloom's truck climbed the muddy switchbacks toward Cascade Ridge, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against sheets of rain that had been falling for 36 hours straight. The Washington state wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, a cathedral of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that now wept rivers of brown water down their ancient trunks, carrying away topsoil that had taken centuries to accumulate. Her volunteer firefighter radio buzzed with coordinates and code words that painted a picture of devastation. Landslides, missing persons, structures compromised, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that awaited her at the end of the logging road. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something biblical, as if the earth itself was purging its sins through mud and stone, washing away the works of man with the indifference of divine judgment. Angela's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she navigated around fallen trees and washouts, her heart heavy with the knowledge that somewhere in this chaos, people were counting on her to bring them home. The call had come in at dawn. 2 hikers missing for 3 days, last seen heading toward an old hunting cabin that local maps showed perched on a hillside overlooking Salmon Creek. Angela knew the area well from her years rescuing horses from neglectful owners and abandoned properties, had walked these trails in sunshine and snow, but the storm had rewritten the geography with ruthless efficiency. What had once been gentle slopes were now scarred with fresh slide zones, and the creek that gave the area its name had swollen into a brown torrent that carried entire trees like matchsticks toward the valley below. The missing hikers, a young couple from Seattle celebrating their engagement, had planned a simple overnight trip to propose at sunrise, but the weather had turned violent with the sudden fury that mountain storms could unleash. Their families had been calling every hour, voices breaking with each update that brought no news, and Angela felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. As her truck rounded the final bend, Angela saw the other rescue vehicles already positioned along the road: County Sheriff's Department, search and rescue, an ambulance with its lights painting the grey morning in urgent reds and blues. The incident commander, a grizzled veteran named Tom Hendricks, whom Angela had worked with on dozens of calls, approached her vehicle with the measured gait of a man who had seen too much tragedy to rush toward more. His face was etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions, and when he leaned down to her window, Angela could see the weight of command in his eyes. "We've got a situation up there," he said, pointing toward a barely visible structure through the trees, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that emergency responders used when hope was running thin. "Cabin's been compromised by the slide, but there's a horse up there that won't let anyone near the place." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Angela felt something stir in her chest, a recognition that this call would be different from all the others. The climb to the cabin required them to navigate a treacherous path that the landslide had carved through what had once been a gentle hiking trail. Each step a negotiation with loose rock and slick mud that threatened to send them tumbling down the mountainside. Angela carried her rescue pack and a lead rope, standard equipment for horse emergencies, but she also brought something else, an intuition honed by years of working with animals in crisis, a sixth sense that told her when fear was masking something deeper. The other rescuers moved with the methodical precision of professionals, but Angela could feel their frustration radiating like heat from a forge, their inability to understand why a horse would choose to remain in obvious danger when every instinct should drive it to safety. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning the forest floor into a treacherous maze of hidden roots and sudden drop-offs. And with each step higher, the sound of the swollen creek below grew more distant, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. The very air felt charged with tension, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for some cosmic resolution to the drama unfolding on its slopes. When they finally reached the clearing where the cabins stood, Angela's breath caught in her throat at the sight that greeted them. A structure that seemed to exist in defiance of gravity and common sense, its foundation undermined by the slide until it tilted at an angle that should have sent it tumbling into the ravine below. The building was old, probably dating back to the 1940s, when logging crews used such places as temporary shelters, its weathered cedar siding now dark with moisture and age, windows clouded with decades of mountain weather. But it was the horse that commanded attention, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face who stood motionless on the cabin's covered porch, her body positioned like a guardian at the gates of some ancient temple. The animal's coat was soaked through, her mane plastered against her neck, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Angela's skin prickle with recognition. This was not the random presence of a lost animal, but something far more purposeful. The mare's gaze swept across the assembled rescuers with the measured assessment of a sentry, and when her eyes met Angela's, there was a moment of communication that transcended species, a silent plea that spoke of secrets hidden beneath rotting floorboards and the desperate need for someone to understand. The other rescuers had already made several attempts to approach the cabin, but each time they drew near, the mare would lower her head and paw the porch with her front hooves, a rhythmic drumbeat that echoed across the clearing like a primitive warning. Tom Hendricks had tried using food to lure her away, had even brought in a local rancher who claimed to have a way with horses, but the chestnut mare remained unmoved, her vigil unbroken despite the obvious danger of her position. The cabin creaked and groaned with each gust of wind, its compromised structure threatening to collapse at any moment, and everyone present understood that time was running out. For the missing hikers, for the horse, and for any chance of a successful rescue. Angela studied the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading the subtle language of animal behavior, noting the way the mare's ears swiveled constantly toward the cabin's interior, the manner in which she positioned herself directly over a specific section of the porch, the almost ritualistic nature of her pawing that suggested not random anxiety, but deliberate communication. As the rain continued to fall and the mountain continued its slow-motion avalanche toward the valley below, Angela felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in her mind. A pattern emerging from chaos that would soon demand everything she had learned about trust, courage, and the sacred bond between human and animal. The mare's eyes held secrets that could save lives, but only if someone was brave enough to listen to what she was trying to say. Angela approached the cabin with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood that trust was a currency earned in heartbeats and lost in sudden gestures, her boots finding purchase on the rain-slicked ground as she studied the chestnut mare's body language with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient text. The horse, whom she had already begun thinking of as Echo, though she couldn't say why the name had come to her, stood with her weight distributed evenly across all four legs, a stance that spoke of endurance rather than panic, of a decision made and held despite mounting pressure from both nature and man. The mare's breathing was steady but deep, her nostrils flaring slightly with each exhale, and Angela could see the subtle tremor in her flanks that indicated exhaustion held in check by sheer force of will. This was not a horse in flight mode, Not an animal driven by blind terror, but something far more complex, a creature operating on a level of understanding that transcended the simple fight-or-flight responses that governed most animal behavior. The recognition sent a chill down Angela's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold, because in her years of rescue work, she had learned that animals possessed an awareness of death and danger that often surpassed human perception. The other rescuers maintained their distance, forming a loose semicircle around the clearing as they watched Angela work, their faces reflecting a mixture of professional skepticism and growing concern for the structural integrity of the cabin that groaned and shifted with each gust of wind. Tom Hendricks spoke in low tones into his radio, coordinating with the incident command post down the mountain, his words carrying the weight of decisions that could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. The missing hikers had now been unaccounted for over 70 hours, well beyond the window when exposure and dehydration began to claim lives, and everyone present understood that each minute spent dealing with the horse was a minute stolen from whatever slim chances remained for the young couple who had come to these mountains to celebrate their future together. But Angela had seen enough animal behavior to know that Echo's presence here was not coincidental, that the mare's refusal to abandon her post spoke of knowledge that human logic had yet to grasp. The horse's ears remained constantly in motion, swiveling toward sounds that the humans couldn't detect, her entire body attuned to frequencies of distress that existed below the threshold of human perception. As Angela drew closer, she began to speak in the low, rhythmic tones that she had learned could calm even the most traumatized animals, her voice carrying across the clearing like a prayer offered to the mountain gods who seemed to be testing everyone's faith this gray morning. "Easy, girl," she murmured, each word carefully modulated to convey safety and understanding. "I see you, I hear you, and I'm not going to make you leave until you're ready." Udun, the mare's ears, flicked forward at the sound of Angela's voice, and for the first time since the rescuers had arrived, Echo's rigid posture softened slightly, her head turning to track Angela's approach with eyes that held depths of intelligence that made Angela's breath catch in her throat. This was not the vacant stare of a panicked animal, but the focused attention of a creature engaged in communication, and Angela felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when the barrier between species dissolved and understanding flowed like current between 2 points of connection. The rain continued to fall, turning the clearing into an amphitheater of mud and mist, but in that moment, the world contracted to just Angela and Echo, predator and prey, setting aside millions of years of evolutionary programming to engage in something approaching conversation. When Angela reached the edge of the porch, Echo's behavior shifted into something that made the hair on the back of Angela's neck stand up in primitive recognition. The mare began to paw at the wooden planks beneath her hooves with a precision and rhythm that spoke of deliberate intent rather than nervous energy. The sound echoed through the clearing like a drumbeat, each strike of hoof against wood carrying a message that Angela's conscious mind struggled to decode, but her deeper instincts recognized as urgent communication. The pattern was complex: 3 quick strikes, followed by a pause, then 2 longer scrapes that sent splinters flying from the weathered boards, then another pause before the sequence repeated. Angela had worked with enough horses to know that this was not random behavior, not the mindless repetition of a stressed animal, but something approaching language, a code that Echo was desperately trying to transmit to anyone with the wisdom to listen. The mare's eyes never left Angela's face during this performance, and in their brown depths, Angela could see a plea that transcended species, the universal cry of one conscious being trying to save another. The realization hit Angela like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending adrenaline coursing through her veins as the pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped into place with the clarity of divine revelation. Echo wasn't guarding the cabin from intruders. She was guarding something beneath it, something that her superior senses had detected and her loyalty compelled her to protect. The mare's positioning on the porch, her refusal to abandon her post despite obvious danger, her rhythmic pawing at the floorboards. It all pointed to the same impossible conclusion that made Angela's heart race with equal parts hope and terror. "Tom!" she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with an urgency that made every head turn in her direction. "We need to check under the cabin. There's something down there that she's trying to tell us about." "Days," the words felt strange in her mouth, as if she was translating from a language she had never learned but somehow understood, and she could see the skepticism in the other rescuers' faces as they processed her claim. But Echo's behavior had shifted again, her pawing becoming more frantic, more insistent, as if she sensed that her message was finally being received and time was running desperately short. The cabin groaned ominously as the wind picked up, its compromised foundation shifting another degree toward the inevitable collapse that would send tons of timber and debris cascading down the mountainside, taking with it any secrets that might be hidden in its depths. Angela could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the assembled rescuers like the storm clouds that continued to gather overhead, the terrible calculus of risk versus reward that defined every emergency response playing out in real time. But as she looked into Echo's eyes, seeing the exhaustion and determination that had kept the mare at her post through 2 days of storm and terror, Angela knew with the certainty of faith that they were standing at the threshold of miracle or tragedy, and that the choice between them rested on their willingness to trust in the wisdom of a creature who had never learned to lie. The mountain held its breath, the rain paused in its relentless assault, and in that moment of suspended time, Angela felt the presence of something larger than human understanding, a force that worked through the loyalty of animals and the courage of those willing to listen to voices that spoke without words. Echo's message was becoming clearer with each desperate strike of her hooves, but would they understand in time to save the lives hanging in the balance below? The decision to investigate beneath the cabin required a delicate choreography of human courage and animal trust, as Angela worked to convince Echo to step aside while Tom Hendricks coordinated the technical rescue that would either vindicate the mare's vigil or confirm the worst fears that had been growing in everyone's hearts since the hikers first went missing. The chestnut mare's resistance to leaving her post was absolute, her hooves planted on the weathered porch boards as if she had grown roots into the mountain itself. But Angela could see the exhaustion beginning to tell in the slight tremor of her legs and the way her head had begun to droop between bouts of frantic pawing. The cabin's structural integrity was deteriorating by the hour, each gust of wind causing new creaks and groans that spoke of imminent collapse, and the rescue team faced the terrible choice between forcing the horse to safety and risking the loss of whatever she was trying to protect. The rain had intensified again, turning the clearing into a muddy amphitheater where life and death decisions played out against a backdrop of ancient trees that had witnessed countless storms, but perhaps never one quite like this. Angela positioned herself at Echo's shoulder, speaking in the low, steady tones that had calmed 1,000 frightened animals, her words carrying promises of understanding and protection that she prayed she could keep. The breakthrough came when Angela noticed that Echo's pawing had shifted to a specific section of the porch, an area roughly 3 feet square where the board seemed to give slightly under the mare's weight, suggesting either rot or a deliberate opening that had been covered over time. Tom Hendricks approached with a crowbar and flashlight, his movements careful and measured as he worked around the horse who continued to guard her chosen spot with the dedication of a temple sentinel. The first board came up with surprising ease, revealing a darkness beneath that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams, and the musty smell that rose from the opening carried hints of human presence that made everyone's pulse quicken with equal parts hope and dread. Echo's behavior changed immediately when the opening appeared, her frantic energy shifting to something approaching relief, as if a burden she had carried for days was finally being shared with creatures capable of action. The mare stepped back, just far enough to allow the rescuers access while maintaining her vigil, her eyes never leaving the dark opening that had become the focal point of all their desperate hopes. Tom's flashlight beam penetrated the gloom beneath the cabin, revealing a crude cellar that had probably been dug during the structure's original construction. Its earthen walls shored up with rough timber that spoke of Depression-era craftsmanship when men built with their hands and whatever materials the forest provided. The space was larger than anyone had expected, extending well beyond the cabin's footprint into the hillside itself. And as the beam swept across the darkness, it caught the reflection of something that made Tom's breath catch in his throat, the metallic glint of a survival blanket, the kind that hikers carried for emergencies, wrapped around shapes that could only be human forms. "We've got them!" he called out, his voice cracking with emotion as he prepared to descend into the cellar that Echo had been guarding with her life. But even as hope surged through the assembled rescuers, they could see that the situation was far from resolved. The missing hikers were alive, but their condition was unknown, and the cabin above them continued its slow-motion collapse toward the ravine below, threatening to bury both rescuers and victims in tons of debris. The descent into the cellar required a careful balance of speed and caution as Tom lowered himself through the opening, while Angela maintained her position with Echo, whose agitation had returned now that humans were entering the space she had protected for so long. The mare's ears swiveled constantly between the sounds from below and the ominous creaking of the cabin above, her entire body tense with the awareness that danger was approaching from multiple directions. From the darkness beneath came Tom's voice, steady and professional despite the emotion that colored his words. 2 victims, conscious but hypothermic, possible injuries from the initial fall. The young couple, David and Sarah, according to the missing persons report, had been trapped in the cellar for 3 days, surviving on the meager supplies from their day packs and whatever warmth they could generate in the confined space. Their voices, weak but audible, rose from the opening like prayers answered, and Angela felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks as she realized that Echo's impossible vigil had indeed saved 2 lives that would have been lost without her intervention. The rescue operation that followed tested every skill and resource that the team possessed as they worked to extract 2 hypothermic victims from a collapsing structure while a storm raged around them, and a horse who had become their unlikely ally watched every move with the intensity of a guardian angel. Echo's behavior during the extraction was remarkable. She seemed to understand that her job was nearly complete, but she refused to abandon her post until both hikers had been brought to the surface and loaded onto stretchers for the treacherous journey down the mountain. The mare's eyes followed every movement of the rescue, her head turning to track the progress of the stretcher teams as they navigated the muddy slope toward the waiting ambulances below. David and Sarah, wrapped in emergency blankets and barely conscious from their ordeal, had enough strength to look back at the horse who had saved their lives, and in that moment of recognition, Angela saw something pass between human and animal that transcended the boundaries of species, an acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid. As the last of the rescue team prepared to evacuate the area, the cabin finally surrendered to the forces that had been working against it for days, its compromised foundation giving way with a sound like thunder that echoed across the valley below. The structure collapsed in slow motion, timbers and debris cascading down the mountainside in an avalanche of destruction that would have claimed any lives still trapped within its walls. But Echo had moved away from the porch just moments before, as if she possessed some supernatural awareness of the exact moment when her vigil could finally end, and she stood now at Angela's side, her head lowered in exhaustion, but her eyes still bright with the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. The mare had lost weight during her 3-day fast, her ribs showing through her rain-soaked coat, but there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of sacrifice willingly made and purpose successfully achieved. As Angela led Echo down the mountain toward safety and the veterinary care she desperately needed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something miraculous, a demonstration of loyalty and intuition that challenged everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. The cellar had given up its secrets, but Echo's vigil had revealed something even more profound, the unbreakable bond between protector and protected that transcends all understanding. The journey down the mountain transformed into a procession of the saved and the savior, as Angela led Echo along the treacherous path while the rescue teams ahead of them carried David and Sarah toward the medical care that would determine whether their 3-day ordeal in the cellar would leave permanent damage or become simply another story of survival against impossible odds. The chestnut mare moved with the careful steps of exhaustion, her hooves finding purchase on the slick rocks with the muscle memory of a creature born to navigate difficult terrain. But Angela could see the toll that her vigil had taken in the way Echo's head hung low, and her breathing came in deep, measured draws that spoke of a body pushed beyond its normal limits. The rain had finally begun to ease, though the clouds still hung low over the valley like a grey shroud, and the sound of the swollen creek below provided a constant reminder of the forces that had nearly claimed 4 lives on this storm-ravaged mountainside. Each step downward felt like a movement away from the sacred and back toward the ordinary world, where horses were simply animals and miracles were explained away by coincidence and luck. The veterinarian who met them at the base of the mountain was Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman whose reputation for treating rescue animals had brought her from Seattle at Angela's urgent request, and her examination of Echo revealed the full extent of the mare's sacrifice in terms that made Angela's heart ache with admiration and concern. 3 days without food had left the horse dehydrated and weak, her body drawing on reserves that spoke of a constitution strengthened by years of good care before whatever circumstances had brought her to that remote cabin. But it was Echo's hooves that told the most compelling story. Worn raw from her constant pawing at the porch boards, the frogs bruised and tender from hours of deliberate communication that had literally carved her message into the wooden planks above the trapped hikers. Dr. Chen worked with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that healing was as much about trust as medicine, her hands moving over Echo's body with the reverence due to a creature who had proven that heroism was not limited to human hearts. The mare stood quietly for the examination, as if she understood that her ordeal was finally over and she could surrender the terrible responsibility that had kept her at her post through storm and exhaustion. The story of Echo's vigil spread through the rescue community with the speed of wildfire, carried by radio chatter and social media posts that transformed a routine missing persons case into something approaching legend. But Angela found herself struggling with the weight of witness that came with being the one who had finally understood the mare's message. The rational part of her mind insisted on searching for logical explanations. Perhaps Echo had simply been a stray horse seeking shelter who had become trapped by the storm, her behavior nothing more than the random actions of a frightened animal. But the evidence argued against such simple interpretations, the precision of her positioning over the cellar entrance, the rhythmic nature of her pawing that had continued for days without variation, the way she had seemed to communicate directly with Angela in those crucial moments when understanding finally dawned. The mare's eyes held memories that Angela could only guess at, experiences that had shaped her into the kind of creature who would choose sacrifice over safety, duty over survival. As the hours passed and Echo's strength began to return under Dr. Chen's care, Angela found herself wondering about the forces that had brought horse and hikers together in that remote place. the invisible threads of connection that had woven a story of salvation from the raw materials of storm and stone. The missing hikers, David and Sarah, were transported to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, where their recovery became a testament to the human body's ability to endure conditions that should have proven fatal. But it was their account of Echo's presence that added the final pieces to a puzzle that challenged conventional understanding of animal behavior. According to their whispered testimony from hospital beds, the mare had appeared at the cabin shortly after their fall into the cellar, her hooves drumming overhead in patterns that had provided comfort during their darkest hours of despair. They had heard her moving above them, pacing and pawing, and somehow her presence had given them the strength to believe that rescue would come, that their cries for help were being heard and transmitted by a messenger who would not abandon her post. David, his voice still weak from hypothermia, described how Echo's rhythmic pawing had become a kind of heartbeat that marked the passage of time and reminded them that they were not alone in their underground prison. Sarah, tears streaming down her face as she spoke, insisted that the horse had saved their lives not just by alerting rescuers to their location, but by providing the psychological anchor that had kept them from surrendering to despair during the endless hours of cold and darkness. The media attention that followed threatened to transform Echo into a symbol rather than a living creature, with reporters and camera crews descending on the veterinary clinic where she was recovering, their questions seeking to reduce her story to sound bites and headlines that could be easily consumed and forgotten. But Angela found herself fiercely protective of the mare's privacy, understanding that whatever had driven Echo to her extraordinary vigil was too sacred to be cheapened by publicity and speculation. The horse herself seemed largely indifferent to the attention, her focus turned inward as her body healed and her spirit processed whatever trauma had shaped her into a guardian angel with hooves and mane. Dr. Chen reported that Echo's recovery was proceeding better than expected, her vital signs stabilizing and her appetite returning as the stress of her ordeal began to fade. But there remained something in the mare's eyes that spoke of experiences that had changed her in ways that veterinary science could not measure or heal. Angela spent hours at Echo's side, brushing her coat and speaking in the low tones that had first established their connection. And in those quiet moments, she felt the presence of something larger than either of them. A force that worked through the loyalty of animals and the courage of humans to create moments of grace in a world too often defined by tragedy and loss. As the days passed and Echo's strength returned, Angela faced the question that had been growing in her heart since that first moment of recognition in the storm-ravaged clearing. What would become of a horse who had proven herself capable of such extraordinary devotion? And how could any ordinary life contain a spirit that had touched the divine through sacrifice and service? The mare's future remained uncertain, her past a mystery that might never be fully solved, but Angela knew with the certainty of faith that Echo's story was far from over. The mountain had tested them all and found them worthy, had brought together human and animal in a demonstration of loyalty that transcended species and challenged every assumption about the boundaries of consciousness and care. As Angela looked into Echo's eyes, seeing the intelligence and depth that had first captured her attention, she understood that she was no longer simply a rescuer, but a guardian of something precious and rare, a creature who had proven that heroism came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage were performed by those who could not speak, but whose actions echoed louder than any words. Echo's vigil was over, but the bonds forged in that storm-lashed clearing would endure long after the mountain healed its scars and the world moved on to other stories. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear, but Angela carried the scent of pine smoke and horse sweat on her jacket like a benediction. She stood outside the recovery room, where Sarah and Michael lay connected to machines that beeped their gratitude in electronic hymns, their faces pale as communion wafers, but breathing with the rhythm of the saved. Through the window, she watched their families gather like congregants around an altar, hands clasped in prayer and disbelief, their whispered thanks rising like incense toward fluorescent lights that buzzed with the persistence of guardian angels. The doctors spoke in measured tones about hypothermia and dehydration, about the miracle of survival, but Angela knew they were missing the deeper truth that pulsed beneath their clinical observations. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep through like a reminder of the cellar's darkness, and wondered if the rescued would ever understand that their salvation had come not from human hands, but from a heart that beat with ancient loyalty. The weight of witness settled on her shoulders, like a mantle she had never asked to wear, but could never set aside. Down the hallway, a television mounted on the wall flickered with news footage of the rescue, the reporter's voice cutting through the hospital's hushed reverence with words that felt inadequate and small. They called it a miracle, a stroke of luck, a happy ending to a story that could have ended in tragedy, but Angela heard the hollow ring of explanation that missed the sacred center of what had transpired. The camera panned across the collapsed cabin, now nothing more than splintered wood and broken dreams, while the reporter spoke of landslides and weather patterns, as if nature's fury could be contained within meteorological charts. But Angela had seen the truth in Echo's eyes, had felt the tremor of something larger than science in the way the mayor had refused to abandon her post, and she knew that some stories could not be captured by cameras or contained within the neat boundaries of evening news. The rescued hikers would heal, the cabin would be cleared away, the mountain would settle back into its ancient silence, but the memory of that vigil would burn in her chest like a coal that could never be extinguished. She thought of Echo now, standing in the temporary paddock behind the fire station, her coat still bearing the mud and debris of her 2-day watch, her eyes holding depths that spoke of things beyond human understanding. The veterinarian had pronounced her healthy despite her ordeal, marveling at her condition after 48 hours without food or water. But Angela knew that some forms of sustenance could not be measured in calories or hydration levels. The mayor had fed on purpose, had drunk from the well of ancient covenant that bound protector to protected, and had emerged from her trial not weakened, but somehow strengthened by the weight of her calling. When Angela had led her away from the ruins, Echo had turned back once, her gaze lingering on the place where she had kept her vigil, as if committing every detail to memory before allowing herself to be led toward rest. The gesture had broken something open in Angela's chest, a recognition that passed between species, like a secret shared in the darkness of understanding. The families in the recovery room began to notice her presence, their eyes finding her through the glass with expressions that mixed gratitude and bewilderment, as if they were trying to solve an equation that had too many variables and not enough known quantities. She had given her statement to the authorities, had explained the sequence of events in the careful language of official reports, but she knew that the real story lived in spaces between words, in the silence that stretched between heartbeats, in the faith that required no evidence beyond the simple fact of survival. Sarah's mother approached the window, her face streaked with tears that caught the harsh hospital lighting like fragments of broken crystal, and mouthed the word, "Thank you," with lips that trembled with the weight of debt that could never be repaid. Angela nodded, feeling the inadequacy of human gesture in the face of divine intervention, knowing that the thanks belonged not to her, but to a chestnut mare who had chosen love over safety, duty over comfort, faith over the easy path of abandonment. The night pressed against the hospital windows like a living thing, and Angela felt the pull of the darkness, calling her back to the place where miracles were born from the marriage of desperation and devotion. She had seen enough rescues to know that most stories ended differently, that the mountains kept their secrets and the missing stayed missing, that hope was often nothing more than a cruel joke played by circumstance on those who dared to believe. But Echo had rewritten the rules, with her stubborn refusal to accept defeat, had stood as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the lost, and had proven that sometimes love was stronger than logic, faith more powerful than fear. The weight of that knowledge settled in Angela's bones, like a truth too large for her body to contain, and she knew that she would carry it with her for the rest of her days. A burden and a blessing wrapped in the memory of a horse who had refused to let hope die in the darkness of a collapsing world. As she turned to leave, the soft sound of her boots on linoleum echoing through corridors that had witnessed countless endings and beginnings, Angela felt the presence of something larger than herself walking beside her, a shadow cast by wings she could not see, but whose protection she could feel like a hand on her shoulder. The rescued would heal. The families would rebuild their shattered faith in happy endings. The mountain would settle back into its eternal patience, but the story of Echo's vigil would live on in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breath and prayer, in the moment when hope chose to stand its ground against the advancing darkness and refused to be moved. In the sacred mathematics of rescue, some equations could only be solved by hearts that beat with the rhythm of ancient loyalty, and Echo had proven that love was the only constant in a world where everything else could crumble and fall. The fire station had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, though the visitors came not with candles and prayers, but with carrots and apples, their offerings humble as widows' mites, but carrying the weight of profound gratitude. Angela watched from the bay doors as families arrived throughout the week, their children pressing small faces against the paddock fence, while Echo grazed with the patient dignity of a saint who had grown accustomed to veneration. The mare seemed to understand her role in this strange liturgy of thanksgiving, accepting the gentle touches and whispered words with the grace of one who had looked into the abyss and chosen to stand guard against its hunger. Sarah and Michael had been released from the hospital, their bodies healed, but their spirits forever marked by the knowledge that their salvation had come from a source they could never fully comprehend, and they returned each day like pilgrims to a shrine, seeking some way to repay a debt that existed beyond the currency of human transaction. The local news crews had moved on to other stories, but the deeper narrative continued to unfold in the quiet moments between strangers and the horse who had redefined the meaning of faithfulness. Angela found herself studying Echo with new eyes, searching for some sign of the transformation that such an ordeal should have wrought, but the mare remained mysteriously unchanged. As if standing vigil over the dying had been simply another day's work in a life dedicated to purposes larger than comfort or safety. The veterinarian had run every test imaginable, marveling at the absence of stress markers or signs of trauma. But Angela knew that some forms of strength could not be measured in blood work or x-rays. Echo carried her experience like a secret, written in a language only she could read, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of communion with forces that operated beyond the boundaries of scientific understanding. When the crowds thinned and the offerings were consumed, when the last grateful family had whispered their thanks and departed, Echo would stand at the fence looking toward the mountains with an expression that seemed to be listening for calls that only she could hear. The sight filled Angela with a mixture of awe and unease, as if she were witnessing something that existed at the very edge of the natural world, where instinct merged with something approaching the divine. The other horses at the rescue facility seemed to sense the change in Echo, giving her a respectful distance that spoke of recognition rather than fear, as if they understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Angela had seen this before in working animals who had been tested by fire and emerged transformed, their spirits tempered by trials that revealed the true depth of their character. But Echo's transformation felt different, more profound, as if her vigil had opened doorways in her consciousness that would never again be closed. She moved through her days with the quiet authority of one who had been entrusted with sacred knowledge, her presence bringing a sense of peace to the other rescued animals that settled over the facility like a benediction. The volunteers spoke in hushed tones about the change in atmosphere, the way conflicts seemed to resolve themselves, and anxious horses found calm in Echo's vicinity, as if her experience had somehow sanctified the very ground she walked upon. Dr. Martinez, the facility's consulting veterinarian, had taken to visiting more frequently than his schedule required, drawn by a professional curiosity that had evolved into something approaching reverence. He would stand at Echo's stall for long minutes, his scientific mind wrestling with observations that defied explanation, his instruments useless in the face of a mystery that existed beyond the reach of measurement. "I've never seen anything like it," he confided to Angela one evening as they watched Echo graze in the golden light of sunset, her coat gleaming like burnished copper against the backdrop of distant mountains. "It's as if she's been touched by something that exists outside our understanding of animal psychology. The way she carries herself, the peace she radiates. It's almost—" He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between science and faith, between observation and wonder. "It's almost holy," he finished quietly, the admission hanging in the air between them like a prayer spoken in a language neither fully understood but both somehow recognized as true. The rescue facility had always been a place of healing, but Echo's presence had transformed it into something approaching a sanctuary where broken animals found not just physical restoration but a deeper form of peace that seemed to emanate from the mayor's very being. Angela watched volunteers linger longer than necessary, their tasks completed, but their spirits reluctant to leave the circle of calm that surrounded Echo like an invisible cathedral. Children who had been afraid of horses found courage in her gentle presence, their small hands reaching through fence rails to touch the muzzle of the mare who had proven that love could triumph over the darkest circumstances. The facility's donation box overflowed with offerings from visitors who came not seeking to adopt, but simply to witness, to stand in the presence of something that reminded them that miracles still walked among them on four legs and breathed with the rhythm of ancient faithfulness. As autumn deepened and the mountains prepared for winter's embrace, Angela found herself spending more time in Echo's company, drawn by a need she could not name to understand the source of the mare's transformation. She would sit on the fence rail in the early morning hours, watching Echo move through her routines with the measured grace of a monk following ancient rituals, and feel something in her own spirit responding to the mare's quiet authority. The rescue work that had once felt like a calling now seemed like preparation for something larger, as if Echo's vigil had revealed the true purpose that lay hidden beneath the surface of their shared mission. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between breath and prayer, Angela began to understand that some forms of salvation could only be achieved through the willingness to stand guard against the darkness, to refuse abandonment even when hope seemed lost, to believe that love was stronger than fear and faith more enduring than despair. In the cathedral of the everyday, where miracles wore the humble disguise of horsehair and heartbeat, Echo had become both priest and prayer, a living reminder that grace could be found in the most unlikely guardians. Winter arrived early that year, painting the mountains in shades of silver and silence, but the story of Echo's vigil had taken root in the community's collective memory like a seed that would bloom in unexpected seasons. Angela found herself invited to speak at churches and community centers, her reluctant words carrying the weight of witness to audiences hungry for proof that faith still moved in the world with hooves and heartbeat. She spoke of the mayor's refusal to abandon her post, of the way love had manifested in the simple act of standing guard, and watched faces transform as listeners recognized something in the story that spoke to their own deepest longings for purpose and meaning. The tale had grown in the telling, acquiring details that Angela had never mentioned, but that felt true, in the way that legends feel true, as if the community's need for hope had shaped the narrative into something larger than the sum of its facts. Echo had become more than a horse. She had become a symbol of the kind of faithfulness that the world seemed to have forgotten. A reminder that some forms of love required no reward beyond the knowledge that duty had been fulfilled. The rescue facility had become a destination for pilgrims of all kinds, from families seeking to teach their children about loyalty to veterans who recognized something familiar in Echo's unwavering dedication to those under her protection. Angela watched these visitors with growing understanding, seeing in their faces the same hunger that had driven her own journey from cynicism to faith, from doubt to the kind of belief that could only be earned through witness to the impossible. A group of retired soldiers had taken to volunteering at the facility, their weathered hands gentle as they groomed the rescued horses, their eyes holding the recognition of one guardian for another. They spoke little of their own service, but Angela could see in their careful attention to Echo the acknowledgement of a kinship that transcended species, a brotherhood of those who had chosen to stand watch while others slept safely in their beds. The mayor accepted their reverence with the same quiet dignity she showed to all her visitors, as if she understood that her story had become larger than herself, a vessel for hopes and dreams that had been searching for a worthy object of devotion. Dr. Martinez had begun documenting Echo's behavior with the methodical precision of a scientist studying a phenomenon that defied classification. His notebooks filled with observations that read more like poetry than clinical data. "She demonstrates what I can only describe as heightened awareness," he wrote in his latest report, the words inadequate containers for the mystery he was attempting to capture. Her responses to environmental stimuli suggest a level of consciousness that exists beyond normal equine parameters. It's as if her experience has opened channels of perception that remain largely dormant in other animals. "Adodi," Angela read his notes with a mixture of amusement and recognition, knowing that no amount of scientific language could contain the truth of what Echo had become. The mayor's transformation existed in the realm of the spirit, where measurement was impossible and explanation was beside the point. She had been touched by something that operated beyond the boundaries of the natural world, and that touch had left her forever changed, forever marked as one who had looked into the darkness and chosen to be a light. The changing seasons brought new challenges to the facility, but Echo's presence seemed to create a buffer against the usual stresses that accompanied the work of rescue and rehabilitation. Horses that had arrived traumatized and broken found healing in her vicinity, their recovery times shortened by proximity to the mare who radiated peace like a living prayer. Angela documented these improvements with the careful attention of one who had learned to recognize miracles in their everyday disguises, noting the way aggressive animals grew calm in Echo's presence, the way fearful creatures found courage in her shadow. The other staff members had begun to speak of the echo effect, a phenomenon they could observe but not explain, a healing that seemed to flow from the mare like water from a hidden spring. Veterinary students came to study her. Researchers arrived with equipment designed to measure the unmeasurable, but Echo remained serenely indifferent to their attention, focused on purposes that existed beyond human understanding or academic curiosity. The anniversary of the rescue approached like a holy day, marked not on calendars, but in the collective memory of a community that had been transformed by the story of a horse who refused to abandon hope. Sarah and Michael had become regular volunteers at the facility, their gratitude expressed not in words, but in the countless hours they spent caring for the animals who had found refuge there. They worked with the quiet intensity of those who understood that their second chance at life came with obligations, that their survival had meaning only insofar as it was used in service to something larger than themselves. Angela watched them brush Echo's coat with reverent care, their hands moving with the gentleness of those who knew they were touching something sacred, and felt the circle of redemption completing itself in ways that no human plan could have orchestrated. The mare stood patiently under their ministrations, her dark eyes holding depths that seemed to encompass all the pain and joy of the world, all the fear and faith that drove human hearts to seek meaning in the midst of chaos. As winter deepened and the mountains settled into their ancient silence, Angela found herself returning again and again to the site where the cabin had stood, now marked only by a small memorial that visitors had created from stones and wildflowers. The landslide had been cleared, the debris removed, but the memory of Echo's vigil lingered in the air like incense, sanctifying the ground where love had triumphed over despair. She would stand in the clearing where the mare had kept her watch, feeling the presence of something larger than herself moving through the silence, and understand that some stories were too important to end, too powerful to be contained within the boundaries of time and circumstance. Echo's vigil had become a legend, but more than that, it had become a promise that faithfulness still existed in the world, that love could still move mountains, that hope could still stand guard against the advancing darkness and refuse to be moved. In the Cathedral of Memory, where stories became prayers and legends took on the weight of scripture, Echo's vigil had carved itself into the mountain's heart, a reminder that some forms of love were as enduring as stone and as eternal as the stars that watched over all who chose to stand guard in the darkness. Spring returned to the mountains with the tentative grace of resurrection, painting the hillsides in shades of green that spoke of renewal and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all living things. Echo moved through the warming days with the measured dignity of one who had been tested by winter and emerged unchanged, her coat gleaming in the strengthening sunlight like burnished copper touched by divine fire. The rescue facility had grown around her presence, expanding to accommodate the increasing number of animals brought by owners who had heard the story and believed that healing could be found in proximity to the mare who had redefined the meaning of faithfulness. Angela watched the transformation with wonder, seeing how Echo's influence had created ripples that spread far beyond the boundaries of their small corner of the world, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. The mare had become more than a symbol. She had become a living prayer, a four-legged reminder that grace still moved in the world with hooves and heartbeat, that miracles still wore the humble disguise of fur and flesh and the willingness to stand guard against the darkness. The first anniversary of the rescue had been marked by a gathering that felt more like a revival than a commemoration, with hundreds of visitors coming to pay their respects to the horse who had refused to let hope die in the depths of a collapsing world. Sarah and Michael had spoken with voices that trembled with gratitude, their words carrying the weight of those who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by love that wore no human face but beat with a heart larger than fear. Children had pressed close to the paddock fence, their small hands reaching through the rails to touch the muzzle of the mare, who had proven that heroes came in all shapes and sizes, that courage could be measured not in grand gestures, but in the simple refusal to abandon one's post when abandonment would have been easier. Echo had accepted their reverence with the patient grace of one who understood that her story had become larger than herself, a vessel for hopes and dreams that had been searching for a worthy object of devotion, a reminder that faithfulness still existed in a world that had grown cynical about the possibility of pure love. Dr. Martinez had published his findings in a veterinary journal, his scientific language struggling to contain the mystery he had witnessed, his conclusions reading more like theology than medical research. The subject demonstrates behavioral patterns that suggest a form of consciousness that exists beyond normal equine parameters, he had written, the words inadequate containers for the truth he was attempting to capture. Her influence on other animals in the facility appears to create measurable improvements in stress levels, recovery times, and overall behavioral stability. While the mechanisms behind these effects remain unclear, the results are undeniable and suggest the presence of factors that operate beyond our current understanding of animal psychology. Angela had read the article with a mixture of amusement and recognition, knowing that no amount of scientific language could explain the source of Echo's power, that some truths could only be apprehended through faith rather than measurement, through witness rather than analysis. The mare's transformation existed in the realm of the spirit, where explanation was beside the point and mystery was its own form of revelation. The rescue facility had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking proof that love could still triumph over despair, that faithfulness still existed in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of loyalty. Veterans came to stand in Echo's presence and remember what it meant to serve something larger than themselves, their weathered faces softening as they recognized in the mare's quiet dignity the same dedication that had once driven them to stand guard over sleeping comrades in distant lands. Families brought children who had lost faith in happy endings, their young hearts healing in proximity to the horse who had proven that miracles still walked among them on four legs and breathed with the rhythm of ancient devotion. Clergy came seeking sermons in the mare's story, finding in her vigil a parable that spoke to the deepest truths of their faith, a reminder that love required no reward beyond the knowledge that duty had been fulfilled and hope had been preserved against the advancing darkness. Angela had begun to understand that her own role in the story was changing, evolving from rescuer to guardian of a legend that had taken on a life of its own. She found herself speaking at conferences and gatherings, her reluctant words carrying the weight of witness to audiences hungry for proof that grace still moved in the world with hooves and heartbeat. The story of Echo's vigil had spread beyond the boundaries of their small community, carried by social media and word of mouth to corners of the world where people were searching for reasons to believe that love was stronger than fear, that faithfulness was more enduring than despair. Letters arrived daily from strangers who had been touched by the tale, their words carrying the weight of lives transformed by the simple knowledge that a horse had once refused to abandon her post, that love had once stood guard against the darkness and emerged victorious through the simple act of refusing to be moved. As the seasons turned and the years began to accumulate like layers of sediment in the mountain's memory, Echo continued her quiet ministry of presence, her influence spreading through the rescue facility like ripples on a still pond. New animals arrived broken and afraid, but they found healing in her vicinity, their spirits mending in ways that defied explanation but could not be denied. Angela watched the transformations with growing wonder, seeing how the mare's story had become a living thing that continued to grow and change, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. The rescue work that had once felt like a calling now seemed like preparation for something larger, as if Echo's vigil had revealed the true purpose that lay hidden beneath the surface of their shared mission. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between breath and prayer, Angela began to understand that some forms of salvation could only be achieved through the willingness to stand guard against the darkness, to refuse abandonment even when hope seemed lost, to believe that love was stronger than fear and faith more enduring than the mountains themselves. In the eternal vigil of the faithful, where love stood guard against the advancing darkness and hope refused to be extinguished by the weight of despair, Echo had become both guardian and guarded, protector and protected, a living reminder that some forms of devotion were as enduring as the stars and as eternal as the love that moved them in their courses through the infinite darkness of space.